We are starting a macro unit. We're going to spend the next few weeks looking at macro photography. Macro photography is extreme close-up photography. Um, this is an example of a macro shot. This is a little baby praying mantis. He's maybe as long as one of these daisy petals. And one of the hallmarks of macro photography, one of the most noticeable aspects, is that you have a really shallow depth of field. And you guys know from early on in the year what depth of field is all about. We used to call it background blur. Well, it is background blur, and it's also blurring of the foreground. So the depth of field is this little space right in here that's still in focus. So I deliberately shot this picture with a shallow depth of field so that this mantis's eyes would be the focus. This is what's sharp. The rest of these things are blurry. So that basically says to the viewer, I want you to look at this right here. It's right in the middle of rule of thirds. It's in sharp focus, and these things are just kind of supporting the main image. This is the main image. So shallow depth of field doesn't just mean a blurred background. It means a blurred foreground and background, and that's very typical of a macro photograph. This was shot with a macro lens. It's a specialized lens that you can get in and get real close up with. Macro lenses are expensive. I don't expect you to run out and buy a $600 macro lens, but we do have macro tubes, and they are like a little blank lens extender tube that you can put between your lens and your camera body, and those will simulate a macro lens, and they're very, very good. They let you use your regular camera body or your regular camera lens to produce this macro effect. Let's real quickly take a look at some more macro stuff. Let's see, here is a thistle, nice close-up of a thistle, very sharp, very blurred background. Here are some lilies, again, very, very blurred background, very shallow depth of field. Here's a honeybee, shallow depth of field. This dogwood picture really illustrates the foreground blur. This petal is facing the viewer, and this petal is facing away. And this area right in here, this little slice of reality, right about where the middle of this flower is all the parts that are in perfect focus. Also notice again, I am using rule of thirds here. Okay? This is a little crab spider. I took a picture of this down in Florida. I made my wife stand there in the heat and wait while I shot and shot and shot to get a good close-up picture of this little crab spider. He's about the size of your fingernail, your pinky fingernail. So look how big I've managed to blow him up. Here's a flower from my backyard, and then some blueberries from my garden. Again, very, very shallow depth of field, using rule of third, having the viewer focus on these blueberries right here that are nice and sharp. Everything else is kind of blurry. And we're back to the mantis. So that is essentially macro photography. Shallow depth of field, you can use macro tubes or a macro lens to get that effect. We're about to do a tutorial that simulates this on any picture, and I have a picture for you to download for that tutorial, and we're going to run that tutorial here very shortly. Well, let's get started on our tutorial. I'm here on Google Classroom, and you have the PDF for the tutorial right here, which I'll be walking you through today, and you have an image that I need you to download for the tutorial. And I'm going to click on that, and I've noticed several of you guys are just clicking and dragging the image off to your desktop, either here or when you open a second window, and that gives you a very low resolution version of the image, and it doesn't work very well. You really need to be clicking download and letting it place that image in your downloads folder, just like I just did. So this is the image that we're going to be using to create this effect with. And this effect is designed to mimic or recreate the very shallow depth of field that you typically get out of a macro lens or a camera that has macro tubes placed on it instead of a macro lens. So I've already got this loaded up in Photoshop, so I'll just skip on over to Photoshop. Here it is. And obviously this was shot from the balcony. And these are full-size people, and this is a full-size scene. But it's going, when we're finished with it, the macro effect kind of fools your eye to make you think it's a teeny little model of a scene. Now, this effect is based on the fact that when you select an area, that is the only area you can work on. Now, what I'm about to show you is related to the tutorial, but don't do this. Don't follow along. You guys know that if you have a selection, and I'll use my rectangular selection here, and then you do something, like in this case, if I go to Filter and I go to Blur, and we're going to be using the surface blur, and I'm just going to blur it real big here, see. It only affects the area that was selected, okay? So this is kind of your reminder of that. Now, for the tutorial, now we're getting started, okay? Now, in this case, we're going to go into Quick Mask mode. While in Quick Mask mode, I'm going to use the gradient tool, and I'm going to make certain that I'm doing this kind of gradient right here. Okay, this is the reflected gradient. We're going to use the reflected gradient because I'm going to make the gradient, I'm going to use the gradient tool in Quick Mask mode to make my selection. And I'm going to start right about here, and I'm going to pull it this way just at a little bit of an angle. Okay, so there's my selection. And if I come back out from under the Quick Mask mode, there it is. Okay, these areas are selected. This area in the middle is not. Remember, in Quick Mask mode, areas that are red are selected. Areas that are normal colored are not. Well, what about these areas in between? Okay, what happens here? Well, if we apply this filter, if we go to Filter, and we go to Blur, and we go to Surface Blur, or in this case, it's asking us to do Lens Blur, so I'll do that. We'll do Lens Blur. It's going to blur these areas, but because we've made this selection with a gradient, that blur is going to gradually taper off. This is our depth of field right here. This is the area that's in focus. Okay, and then it's going to taper off again. So it's giving us a simulated foreground, background sort of a blur. So I click OK. Let's see, I've got my radius set to 52. You can experiment with your radius a little bit. It's really going to depend on what the effect you want. And I click OK. Mine's set for right now 46, and that's fine. It's the amount of blur. Okay, and we'll let it do its thing for a few minutes. But that is effectively, that is the tutorial. We're taking an image that was shot and we're making it look like it was a macro image. Okay, it's taking a while for this blur to do its thing. So I'll just wait. And there it is. Okay, so it's given us, if I go ahead and drop the selection, a really strong blur here. The blur gradually tapers off, as you can see in this person's foot, to where these areas are in good focus, and then the blur gradually picks back up. So essentially, we created a selection using the gradient, and these were fully selected, these pixels partially selected, these pixels not at all, and then partially selected and then fully selected. So by doing that, we gave it this effect that looks like a very, very shallow depth of field. And this is very typical of a macro image. So that is your tutorial. One more step, we're going to give it a little bit of curves. So I'll go ahead and add a little curves adjustment layer on this. Let's get my layers up. Don't see them right away, so we'll go layers. There they are. So I'll go ahead and give it a little curve and brighten it up. There we go. And then I will go ahead and boost the saturation. So I'll go ahead and do a hue saturation adjustment layer. And we'll just give it a little better saturation. Okay, those are things that you can always do to your images. You can always add some curves and adjust the contrast or brighten it up. Saturation's always good. A little bit of sharpening never hurts. Don't over sharpen. But this is the tutorial. This is called the Toy Town Effect, and it's designed to make this scene look like it's a miniature little town that was shot, with a macro lens in close. So this week we're working with macros, and next week as well.